Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Peter Gaiman, professor of Old Testament and Biblical Languages at Shepherd Seminary. This podcast is dedicated to discussing issues related to Scripture and theology. For more information, visit petergaiman.com.
Well, good morning to everybody, or I suppose if you're listening in the afternoon, good afternoon, and if you're listening at night, good night to you. It's a privilege to be with you, as always, and today we're going to talk about 4 cultural thought patterns that influence the Western world. Now, I'm not saying that these are the only things that influence the Western world, because certainly if you are living in America or Canada or Europe, you understand that there are many influences that go into the formation of society. But it's pretty much undeniable that these 4 thought patterns or worldviews are instrumental in formulating what we see going around us in the culture today. And I think it's helpful. Again, if you listen to last episode, you know that I just finished teaching a class on current cultural issues and the biblical worldview, how those go together. So part of this is a survey of some of that material, just putting it together and understanding the issue of what is influencing the culture and how we as Christians should analyze that and assess that. So just on a brief survey, I think there are 4 cultural thought patterns that really are foundational in the Western world to dictating morality, influencing how we view society, and the like. So as Christians, it's really important to be wise, discerning, and identify these things. So I'm just going to go over these briefly, survey them, and hopefully it'll be helpful for us. So the first one that I want to mention is Darwinism. Okay, Darwinism is instrumental in the evolutionary worldview, the idea that human life has evolved from simple one-cell organisms to the very complex. In fact, just as a side note, Darwinism is also, maybe not so much anymore because there's more complexity to biblical studies, but in biblical studies, Darwinism was the prevailing foundational thought for many years, because, say, in Old Testament studies, you had the idea that Israel could not have been a complex religious society in the 15th century, 14th century. Leviticus could not have been written by Moses because there was no complexity of worship for Israel at that time. You need to start with a simple, unorganized version of worship, which then evolves over time into the complex. Same thing in other areas of biblical studies. There's this foundational thought that you must start from the simple and work your way up to the complex. So Darwinism as a thought process or worldview has definitely been influential in biblical studies, but I'm thinking mainly in terms of culture and society right now. Darwinism is typically viewed by even those in the camp as the road to atheism. In fact, I've been listening to some lectures by Jerry Bergman, who, if you're not familiar with him, you should be. He's really quite smart. He's written, I think, 5 or 6 books on Darwinism and its influence on Germany in World War II. And one of the things that in his personal history, he was very much involved in the atheist and Darwin movement, and he was saying in some of his lectures that his editor for one of the publications that he worked for kept saying Darwinism is the key, is the roadway to atheism. So let's talk a lot about Darwinism because that's the pathway to atheism. And what's meant by that is that prior to Darwin and Darwin's theory about the evolution of life, intelligent design or creation was the standard belief. And it was not acceptable it was considered inane or just, irrational to reject the idea of a creator. But Darwinism gives a intellectual pathway that diverges from the idea of creator. And so Darwinism really is the link. It's the key to the one who wants to intellectually be viable in their rejection of God. And so it's this foundation then for atheism, because otherwise atheism is irrational. Now, I would argue atheism is irrational anyway for other reasons, but just as somebody is approaching this from a secular worldview, at least now they have a fallback saying, this is a solution we can use to help us understand the world. So Darwinism is hugely influential, and it actually was very instrumental in some of the key racist ideology that popped up in the middle of the 20th century. Obviously, Germany was very, very much trying to prove themselves the superior race. And many of those who were leaders in the Nazi movement were they had academic PhDs. Some of them had evolutionary PhDs. Very, very influential in this whole movement. In fact, in some of the lectures that Jerry Bergman has given with his research on these issues, he actually noted that when Hitler decided or found out that he was doomed to lose and that they were going to lose, he said, well, I guess it's been proven by tests that the Germans are the inferior race. And so apparently he gave the command to bomb the German cities because he thought he was doing what was right. And it's interesting to think about that. That's something to perceive, is that for the Holocaust and the attempt to exterminate the Jews, in the view of the German elite, it's the right thing to do because of the superiority, the survival of the fittest, to create a clean or pure race. That is the moral imperative of the Darwinian worldview. And so when you think about that, it makes sense. Now, in the United States, we also dealt with that to some degree with the eugenics movement. There were many pushes to sterilize individuals who were unfit to have children, unfit by the societal standards, so that there could be a cleansing of those who were unworthy of having children. So Darwinism did have a tremendous impact, and it is, although it's lessened to its extent with regard to race and racism, it still is prevalent in many other areas. For example, the erosion of morality and the differentiation between human beings and animals. For example, prior to Darwinism and the belief of evolutionary existence, there's a very clear class distinction between animals and people being made in the image of God, having intrinsic value. Well, now you can have discussions with people, and there is no more assumption that human beings are more valuable than animals. And so you can have people making the argument that a gorilla, which is close to extinction, is actually more valuable than a human being just because of the scarcity of that animal. And so we should be willing to kill or to withhold the flourishing of human beings because of the value of a certain animal or for animals in general. So Darwinism does change things for people. And obviously, from a biblical worldview, we would hold to animals being quite valuable, but that's because they're created by God and we are given the task to steward that creation mandate and take care of animals. As Proverbs 12 says, the righteous one has regard for the life of his beast. So we do have a value for animals, but Darwinism essentially equates everything together, saying, all animals are equal. In one sense, it's just random chance that you wind up on certain areas of the food chain, and so it's really dehumanizing to the fullest extent to recognize that there's no purpose to life if you are just at a part on the evolutionary chain, as it were. So it also, by the way, if you think about anthropology now and the outcome of thinking this way, the other thing that comes hand in glove with this is that man cannot be inherently evil because it's just an evolutionary process. And in fact, from the Darwinian anti-God worldview, there is no good or evil. There's just existence. Good and evil are culturally defined, and so they are subjective and change. Therefore, man is not inherently evil. Like in the Christian teaching, the biblical teaching, we would teach that mankind falls prey to original sin, and that from his youth he is bent on doing evil because his heart is tainted by that sin. But in a Darwinian worldview, mankind is neutral at bare minimum or good. It's very common for people to say mankind is good inherently. We need to tap into that good. Well, that comes from that anti-God Darwinism where we just believe in the neutrality of all areas. So what that means then is that when mankind does evil things like a mass murderer, suicide bomber, things like that, we have to identify a cause. And the cause then in the Darwinian worldview would be societal structural injustice. So it's the reason somebody is a murderer is because of some structural injustice. This person was oppressed growing up. And so it wasn't their fault. They were a blank slate, but the culture, defined them, wrote on them like a hard drive, programmed them to do what they did. And so then the solution, the main motivation for a Darwinist is to control society in order to correct these societal injustices. So, for example, you've heard many of the cries to get rid of societal injustice by taking down the current present-day institutions, things like that. That's part of this. Now, Darwinism isn't the only thing that influences that, but from a Darwinian worldview, that makes sense. That as you're looking for an explanation for why there's evil in the world, if you don't hold to the sin within the heart of an individual, in the words of Jesus, where does the sin come from? Well, Matthew 15 says very clearly, it's from the heart of the individual. It's not what goes into a man that defiles him, but what comes out of the heart, meaning that mankind is inherently sinful. Genesis 6, Genesis 9 also give similar kinds of ideas with regard to mankind being evil from their youth. So that's an important influence on our society, this Darwinian notion, and from a biblical worldview, it obviously doesn't compute. It doesn't work, but it's something very significant that's influencing our society. The second major influence that is really at work, especially in the Western world, is the influence of Marxism. Now, I know this is a term that's thrown around a lot, and a lot of times it's next to useless because people just seem to view it as a negative critique. Just like you might call somebody an idiot, if you call them a Marxist, they just think you're name calling. But there's actually a meaning behind the term Marxist and Marxism, and when we define what it means, it can actually be useful. So in order to understand what Marxism is, I do have a previous set of podcast episodes where I go into a little more detail on this, but I just want to survey just briefly what I mean when I'm saying this. In classical Marxism, Karl Marx came up with this theory that the fundamental problem of humanity is oppression built into class systems. Now, he viewed it as an economic problem. You had the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, the ones who had the money, and they oppressed the working class, the proletariat, he called them. So you had the capitalists oppressing the working class, and they abused them to make profits for themselves. And so, according to Karl Marx, this just wouldn't last, and the working class would always rebel against those who were their masters. And so he prophesied that you'd have many rebellions in the capitalist nations around the world. But those rebellions never came. And so in an effort to grapple with that, you had an individual named Antonio Gramsci, who was instrumental in kind of formulating what became known as neo-Marxism. And this neo-Marxism changed Marx's original economic framework to hold that the reason there was no revolution was because it wasn't an economic problem per se, it was a cultural problem. So the culture itself prohibited revolution because people bought into these ideas that were linked with culture. So for Gramsci specifically, Western culture was linked with Christianity, and Christianity must be destroyed in order to allow liberation to come. So Christianity was viewed as the cultural holdup to this utopian revolution of sorts. So for Marx, economics was the problem, and that would lead to a culture. But for Gramsci and neo-Marxists, culture is what leads to economics. So if you go back to the prior episodes that I've done on this, I give you some quotes from Gramsci where he's very specific, saying, we need to replace the Christianized culture. Essentially, God needs to die, and we need to replace it with a socialist utopia. And so that is the neo-Marxist creed, is this de-Christianization of the Western culture. And that needs to happen through a slow and steady infiltration. We need to, as a neo-Marxist, the goal is to get control of the schools, the media, and the universities in order to affect a cultural consensus of change against Christianity. Now, how this plays out then, what we see in our contemporary Western culture is multiple aspects of this. So on the one hand, we see critical theory, which is an outworking of neo-Marxism and the School of Frankfurt, who were influenced in that same kind of camp. And so critical theory is a negative critique, which is an attempt to change certain societal structures. So things like gender theory, queer theory, critical race theory, all of these would fall under the rubric of critical theory. And they are all working in order to subvert the normal societal thought that goes into this oppression. So, for example, it's oppressive for one to believe that there's a difference between male and female, gender theory. And so the critical theory that's involved with gender theory studies that and says, how can we work toward equity so that men and women have the exact same result, all the same in every scenario, basically. And you have queer theory, where how can somebody who's heterosexual have advantages over somebody who's homosexual, things like that. And so it's an attempt then to equalize everything under the rubric of equity. And these are the concepts that are constantly at war. Part of this then is, perhaps you've heard of the term intersectionality. Intersectionality is very common today. Even if you don't know it by name, intersectionality is the concept that if you are a part of an oppressed group, and in this framework, any minority, so any group that has minority status is by definition an oppressed status. Because remember, you have this power dynamic, this power framework here. So anybody who's in the majority is immediately interested in preserving their majority status. And so those who are in the minority then are trying to fight that, and they are being oppressed by the majority. So this can happen in many ways. It can happen in race. So if you're an ethnic minority, you are automatically oppressed. If you're a sexual minority, part of the LGBT spectrum, you are in the oppressed group. If you are disabled, you are a part of an oppressed group. And you just go down the list. Anytime you're in a minority category, you now have access to the claim for oppression. And so this concept of intersectionality basically teaches that you can be a part of multiple groups of oppression, and that gives you a unique identity, a unique oppression that other people don't. It doesn't exist for them. So if you're a black lesbian, for example, you experience unique oppression that others don't, that a black individual might not experience, or a black woman might not experience, but a black lesbian woman would experience a unique foundation of oppression. Therefore, the outcome of this is that if you are not a part of these oppressed groups, then you're not knowledgeable of these oppressions, and you don't have authority to speak on that. So, for example, if you're a female, you are undergoing certain oppressions according to this societal framework, and white males especially, cannot speak on those issues. They can't speak to those issues because they don't know what it's like. So you can't talk about abortion, you can't talk about feminism, you can't talk about LGBT issues. If you're just a straight white male has no authority because of this critical theory hierarchy of intersectionality. Now, let me give an illustration about. See, this is all over the culture. This is one of the foundational things that's so present, and it just comes straight from Marxism, obviously, with a little postmodernism worked in, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But let me give an illustration of how this is showing up just immediately in the cultural headlines today. if you're paying attention to the national headlines in the United States of America, you are no doubt aware that the Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer is retiring. He's expected to retire. He announced his retirement, in fact. And so what President Joe Biden announced was that he was going to fill the Supreme Court vacancy with a black woman. Now, if you think about that, this is where Christians are to think extremely countercultural here, because this is hailed as something that is long overdue. It's hailed as something that is really important to do. And I'm sure some Christians are even in support of that. And as Christians, though, we need to understand the worldview behind this is what Joe Biden is assuming in making that announcement, and people who are supporting that, they're assuming making that announcement, is that a black woman needs to be there because a black woman has a perspective on justice that others do not have because of her access to these groups of oppression. So it has little to nothing to do with qualification. Let's go ahead and say that up front. Notice it's not about who is best for the job. It's, okay, we need somebody in these categories in order to be able to judge effectively. But of course, from a biblical worldview, what we are faced with the definition of true justice is that it is blind. It is one. In fact, that is a statement which coincides completely with the biblical worldview, is that justice is blind. In fact, in the law itself, the law points out that you are not to give privilege to the poor, nor are you to accept a bribe from the rich. But on the basis of 2 or 3 witnesses, you establish the fact of the matter and administrate justice no matter who the individual is. So with that in mind, the biblical standard of justice, it doesn't matter whether the judge is white, black, brown, male, female, whatever. Like that's actually not even important. The only issue for administrating justice is the objective analysis of data. And it's really kind of sad that we have such a race-based influence in our society where we think in terms, and Christians aren't immune to this. You know, we are indoctrinated with this on every level as well, where many times we think in the same kind of terms of the culture that, oh, this person can only be able to deal with this because they are a person of color, or because they are a sexual minority, but that's not at all the truth. In fact, I do have a blog article too that you can check out more on this with a Christian critique of personal experience is what it's titled. A Christian critique of personal experience. And I think it's helpful just to be reminded that personal experience, which is the basis of this intersectionality idea, is really a faulty way of judging or evaluating anything, just because of how biased and selective and sinfully influenced our experiences are. And so we need to think critically about those things, and just to be aware that these ideas, critical theory in particular, which is the offspring of Marxism, has a tremendous influence in our society, and we see it all over the place. So number 3, so we had Darwinism, we had Marxism and critical theory, and then now number 3, postmodernism. So postmodernism has a tremendous influence on society as well. Interestingly enough, postmodernism, historians seem to be in agreement that postmodernism largely is coming out of the fact that critical theory largely failed initially in its application of classical Marxism. Classical Marxism was the worst failure known in political thought life, and yet it still exists today in neo-Marxism. But because there was so much failure, and it completely failed to describe the human condition and human life and how human life was working out, the French theorists, philosophers popularized postmodernism, which was essentially a turning your back on the critical theory initially and saying, well, we can't know anything because what we thought we knew was true is no longer true, so maybe we can't know anything for sure. And so if you're to define postmodernism, it's kind of difficult to define. It's very slippery, but according to Encyclopedia Britannica, it's defined as a late 20th century movement characterized by broad skepticism, subjectivism, or relativism, a general suspicion of reason, and an acute sensitivity to the role of ideology in asserting and maintaining political and economic power. So what that means, that's a bit of a lengthy way to say that postmodernism basically says it's difficult to know things for sure. In fact, some people would say impossible to know things for sure. So there's a skepticism involved in what you can actually know. So you have a book called Cynical Theories by James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose, and I highly commend it to everyone. They're both atheists and they make no precondition to believe in God or anything like that, but they do a good job of analyzing critical theory and postmodernism. And one of the things that they point out is that if you summarize postmodernism, you can basically encapsulate its core teachings into two principles: the postmodern knowledge principle and the postmodern political principle. So the knowledge principle and political principle. The knowledge principle would say that you can't really know something. So there's skepticism about objective knowledge or truth, whether or not you can actually attain that. And postmodernism would teach then knowledge is derived as a cultural construct. So when we're looking at something, it's not as if it's not even the right question to ask whether something is objectively true or not. That's in postmodernism an alien concept. We're not looking for objective truth. We're just analyzing the fact that cultures construct their own truth. And it's really kind of frustrating trying to pin this down, because if you take that kind of mindset, this is where you get the idea of like, oh, well, that's my truth, or that's our truth, or we can have multiple truths, or whatever. And it's super frustrating. And so you have, I think it was Francis Schaeffer who in writing during that time said that Christians basically have to affirm the fact that Christians believe in true truth. True truth. So in other words, as Christians, we would make an absolute claim saying we have claim to real, verifiable, objective truth. And that is the Christian worldview claim. But in postmodernism, I think I've shared this with multiple people before. I don't know if I've mentioned it on the podcast before, but I just remember being blown away sitting next to a lady, and she was reading a book on, spiritual discipline or whatever. So I asked her what she was reading, and she just started to explain about how Buddha, Gandhi, and Jesus all, practice the same thing. And I started to explain with her through a few Bible verses that I don't think that that's an accurate representation of Jesus's life. And I explained to her, John 14:6, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and life. No man comes to the Father except through me. And I said, that's a pretty exhaustive, exclusive claim. And so to say that they're all the same and that everyone can achieve happiness and eternal life through all these different avenues doesn't make sense to me in light of that. And I remember what she said. She said, well, that can be true for you. And I have a different truth. And I just remember thinking to myself, how do you engage in a conversation that exists in that playing field? It's so difficult. And I just remember being struggling, and I just was trying to ask her for clarification, saying, wait, so you are telling me that even though what we're saying is completely contradictory to one another, that they're both right? And she said, yes. And I just remember thinking, this is impossible. But that is the progeny. That's the offspring of this postmodern worldview where, the skepticism about objective truth or knowledge, just the idea of subjective, culturally constructed, there can be multiple truths. Now, in line with that then is the political principle within postmodernism, which basically is the statement that these systems of learning and definition and truth are formed by the power and hierarchies within that culture. So in other words, the elite, those who are in control, formulate the language, the definition, in order to facilitate their version of what they want to be known. And so it's postmodernism at its core is an attempt to try to ascertain that that's what's going on and destroy that. And so that ends up becoming the marching orders of those who embrace critical theory and postmodernism is that, hey, let's destroy the way that society has constructed the way of thinking. So, for example, biblical morality needs to go. You need to have even the way that gender is talked about. Those things all need to be eradicated. So within postmodernism, then, one of the things, there are multiple themes that emerge, but four major themes that Pluckrose and Lindsay point out in the book Cynical Theories is that there are four major themes: the blurring of boundaries, the power of language, cultural relativism, and the loss of the individual and the universal. And just to summarize what that means, in the blurring of boundaries, that means that what you take to be obvious or evident distinctions in life are no longer obvious. So what's the difference between male and female, for example? Well, in the modern world, in the scientific world, in the Christian worldview, that would be relatively easy to discern what is a male, what is a female. But now in the postmodern worldview, there is no answer to that. The boundaries are blurred. There's a spectrum now. It's no longer either or, but it's a spectrum, and you can identify whatever you want. In fact, I saw a really disturbing interview on, I think it was Dr. Phil, actually. I don't normally watch Dr. Phil, but this was a video that was making its rounds on social media where you had a famous conservative commentator, Matt Walsh, on Dr. Phil with two individuals from an LGBT spectrum, and they were being interviewed by Dr. Phil, and Matt Walsh asked these two individuals, "What is a woman?" And the individual responded and said, "That's not for me to say because I don't identify as one." And I just remember thinking to myself, is that the world that we're in where that's the answer? The question as to what is a woman is answered by, that's not for me to say because I'm not a woman. In other words, there is no objective criteria for what a woman is anymore, at least in that worldview. So the blurring of boundaries is essential to this. And also, as we were just talking about, the power of language is also prevalent. And this is where understanding language is intentional. It's communicating something. And so even the way that words are constructed, the way that we speak about things communicate reality. So in postmodernism, then, language needs to be addressed and redefined, reconstituted in order to destroy these cultural perspectives of knowing. So, for example, pronouns, they have to go. Because those are a part of the system to construct this boundary between male and female. So he, she, it. Let's throw those out and use our own pronouns in order to facilitate the destruction of those categories, for example. So language is viewed as a tool with regard to that. Obviously, the third major theme would be cultural relativism, meaning that all cultures are not in a value system. So in other words, one culture cannot be viewed as superior to another culture. Now that is, I've done a blog post on that as well. That's just idiocy to claim that all cultures are relatively equal, because a culture can promote murder, can promote sexism, can promote racism, and that is objectively, according to the biblical standard, worse when a culture is promoting more sin, facilitating more sin inherently. That is objectively worse than a culture that restrains those items, those perpetuities of action. And so when we think of that from a biblical worldview, we would say, yes, there are better cultures than others. But from a postmodern worldview, remember, there's no inherent objective truth, and therefore no inherent objective right or wrong. And so cultural relativism is obviously a major theme within that. And then also within the postmodern worldview, the major theme, the fourth one, would be the loss of the individual and the universal. And what that means is that on both sides of the spectrum, on the individual level, your individual identity is diminished because you're really just a product of the culture or the group which you find yourself. So in other words, the idea of being an individual thinker is lost. So this is why one of the reasons why we as Christians need to be very aware and careful of this is the idea that we are simply products of our culture. We are simply products of our culture. This is a postmodern view where it's saying, no, you're just a product of your culture. You've been taught how to think in those realms, and you've been identified with your groups. You're a straight white male. You're a Christian, therefore you're just embodied in that group. You can't claim to have individually worked these things out and assess them by any objective standard, because you can't be objective. You are just influenced by your groups. This is dangerous. But on the other side too, you can't claim universal experience, because there are different cultures. So you can't say human experience would teach us this, or as a human I have experienced this, because that's not true. Because the way you know things, the way you experience things are culturally constructed. And so you can't claim an experience common to man. So, for example, the fact that all human beings are tempted to do evil, to do sin, that doesn't exist in the postmodern worldview, because there's no such thing as universal experience with regard to that. So it's a dangerous thing, postmodernism. It's influential on a variety of degrees in a variety of ways for individuals in our culture. Some people don't even know they're being influenced by it, but these are influential philosophical thoughts that are at play in our society. So we've had Darwinism, Marxism, critical theory, and postmodernism. And the fourth and final one that I want to talk about in this episode is the social contract theory. So social contract theory, maybe you have or haven't heard of that before, it comes from Jean-Jacques Rousseau from France. Again, France, we have a lot to thank the French for with regard to their political philosophies. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau lived from 1712 to 1778. He was instrumental in many ways, but at least in our purposes today, we want to just think about his social contract theory. In a book that he wrote called The Social Contract, he starts it off with one of his most famous quotes where he said, quote, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. Those who think themselves the masters of others are indeed greater slaves than they." So that's, again, from Rousseau's The Social Contract. So what Rousseau taught was that the key to maintaining natural freedom and having the benefits of a civil society was to renounce one's natural right for freedom and engage in a social contract with others. So in other words, you make social agreements. Relationships in this view are primarily derived in a society through agreement. So you say, hey, it will benefit me to have this kind of relationship with you, and it will benefit you to have this kind of relationship with me. And so we will have this social contract, and we'll work together to communicate, to experience common good, and we will therefore be mutually beneficial to one another. So in Rousseau's thought, mankind was originally autonomous in many regards, disconnected to society. Government, society was cultural innovation, that in Rousseau's thought. And so he's just trying to theorize how it can be most efficient, most effective. And obviously, from a biblical worldview, we understand that government, hierarchy, authority is created by God. I did an episode, I think 2 episodes ago, on that. And so we would embrace that from a biblical worldview. But for Rousseau and the French theorists who follow in his footsteps, and many in the Western cultural circles as well now, this idea of the social contract really highlights consent being the main determiner of any relationship. By the way, this political philosophy by Rousseau was very instrumental. Most historians that I've read identify Rousseau as the key contributor to the French Revolution. And what's interesting is you have the American Revolution and French Revolution happening almost at the same time. American happens first, and then the French Revolution happens almost right after that. But there were tremendous differences. The American Revolution ended with a government that was largely driven by the people and had a lot of political ambiguity to it. There was state governments within a federal government, and you had all these branches of authority, and it was very limiting in governmental authority. Well, what ended up happening at the end of the French Revolution is you ended up having Napoleon just replace the prior authoritarian rule in totalitarianism, and Napoleon comes then and fills the void. And there's a lot of analysis as to why that is, but one of the main things I would argue for, and I'm not unique in arguing for this, but it just seems to make sense from a biblical worldview, is that the French Revolution basically tried to have the American version of the revolution, removing authoritarian government without including God in the picture. And that was the major difference, that you had Rousseau's idea that, okay, we're just going to have a social contract together without understanding that God is involved in the picture and that our ultimate allegiance is to God and he dictates our actions. No, we're going to try to have this social contract of mutual deference to one another for the greater good, etc. But that just did not work at all. And so there was anarchy, and then ultimately Napoleon arises out of that, solidifies through, again, totalitarian means in government. So Rousseau was very influential in this in the French Revolution, but the French Revolution, I don't know if we could really call it a success, if you know what I mean. So what are the ramifications of this theory, though, with regard to what we see today? Well, there are many things that we see. This kind of ideology is still taught, and you probably already thought of this when I mentioned that consent is the main determiner of any relationship. Well, what have we seen with regard to sexual relationships on college campus and things like that? Typically, what people will argue is say, okay, we need to make sure that you can only engage in sexual relations on this college campus if consent is given by both parties. That's the only difference why pedophilia is considered as immoral, is that, according to this world, according to the contemporary worldview, can somebody who's under 18 really give consent as to what they want? Even if they say this is what they want, are we sure that's what they really want? Is that really consent? And so consent becomes the defining characteristic for how we determine what's right or wrong, because of this idea that all relationships are essentially viewed within this rubric of this social contract. And by the way, that's obviously the lens through which all romantic relationships are viewed. And so even marriage, the pinnacle of these relationships, is no longer viewed as a covenant before God and society, but it's just viewed as a mutually acceptable contract, which, if it no longer becomes beneficial for individuals to engage in this social contract of marriage, then it can be dissolved and life can move on. And so marriage becomes just the very basic form of an agreement to live together for mutuality, and it's no longer worth it, or I no longer want to do that, so we abandon that. So it's a huge degradation of marriage. And this also is behind the idea of why even family itself, the redefinition of family, what constitutes a family, is under attack. So think about abortion. One of the interesting things with regard to this idea of social contract theory is the idea of abortion. If you think about on what basis is a mother obligated to care for her child? Like, for example, let's say a mother finds out she's pregnant and she says, well, I want to have an abortion. As a Christian, we would argue that they are killing somebody who's born in the image of God. And that is a correct argument, to be sure. But what's interesting, and I don't think a lot of people understand this, is that most people who get abortions don't just think it's a clump of cells. I mean, that's a very antiquated notion. Most people understand with the advent of ultrasounds and things like that, that this is a real person in miniature form, Actually, that's where they would make the differentiation sometimes, is that this is a real human, but they have not achieved personhood yet. But that's the dilemma, right? Because where in the world does personhood become an issue? Is it when they magically pass from within the mother to the outside world? Is it when they get comprehension? You actually have some prominent philosophers who argue that a individual doesn't become a person and they don't have protection from the law until they actually have cognitive ability to respond and speak and things like that. So some people argue that abortion should last up till 2 years post birth. So it's a crazy world. But if you think about this social contract with the idea of abortion, this is much of what's going behind the scenes, is that in the thought process, this is inconvenient to me. I did not agree. This was not my plan to have a child. And so I did not agree. I don't give permission to have this relationship with the child. And so I'm going to end this relationship because I never initiated that contract of saying, yes, this is okay to have it. And so no longer is the biological imperative even viewed as a responsibility here. It's saying, no, it's what I want. Do I want to enter into this relationship with this child? Yes or no? It's I have the authority I have the autonomy to say whether or not I should enter into this contract for my own happiness, and that is partially based, at least we would say, on this idea of the social contract theory. We also, this is also what's behind the push by many people actually to get rid of parenting in many cases, because parenting is not a biological necessity in a secular worldview, but according to social contract theory, it's a convenience. In many cases, it's viewed as an antiquated way of raising children. And in order to achieve equity, many people are arguing now, and by equity, this is again related to the Marxist push, we want all people to be equal. And so in order to achieve equality, not everyone is as good a parent as others. So in order to achieve equity, even if that means hurting some people, we need to bring everyone to the same level, and we should have the state raise all of the children, because then that would allow for equity. In fact, in the USA Today, I noted a article just this last week, and I saved it just because I knew this kind of thing would come up. It's a January 13 article published in USA Today. It's an opinion piece. It's entitled "California should abolish parenthood in the name of equity." That's such a crazy article. If you think about, like, why in the world are we seeing articles in the USA Today, of all places, that are allowed to argue that parenthood should be abolished so that there's, equity among all children? That is literally the society in which we live. And it's such a sad thing, but this is the framework behind that. It's this idea of social contract theory where, remember, God is removed from the picture in all of these worldviews, in all of these influential processes of thought. And so in this social contract theory, we say, well, it's not, the family itself is not designed by God. It's a social construct. So why don't we get rid of that inferior social construct in order to promote equity? So if equity is the ultimate good, remember, there's morality is self-defined here. So if equity is exalted to the position of the greatest good, then of course, why not get rid of the family? Because the family does contribute to inequity. Yeah, it's actually way more advantageous for kids to be hugged and kissed by their parents. And so the kids that don't get hugged and kissed by their parents, yeah, that puts them at a disadvantage. So let's just remove it all so that we can all have equity, because that's the greatest good. And the social contract theory contributes to this, because we're saying that family was a societal construct anyway. So if we just reorganize, reshuffle society, it's okay to do that in this worldview. By agreement, that will promote the greater benefit to society. So again, all these things influence our society. Don't be surprised when you see those things. Don't be surprised when you see the hookup culture being pushed because it's just viewed as this social contract. I'm going to help you, you help me. And when we decide we don't want each other, don't need each other, we can just abandon that. These thoughts all are founded on these four worldviews. You have Darwinism, Marxism, which contributed critical theory, postmodernism, and the social contract theory of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. These four processes of thought are instrumental in influencing our culture, really causing a lot of confusion, even among Christians in churches, because we get confused as to what's right or wrong. And you just need to understand that a lot of what's being pushed as moral or good and evil are best understood in light of these understandings of the world, these anti-God pushes. Now, these are extremely influential. Once you come to grips with what's going on here, you're going to see them all over the place. And, we're sadly being conditioned to embrace the teachings of these worldviews as well. And so as Christians, we need to be very concerned about that, warned, equipped, and inundated in the Word in order to fight against these philosophies. As Paul says, we don't battle against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, the fruits of darkness, which promote these kinds of ideologies. And so we ought to be well aware of these things. So I hope this is helpful for you. I hope it promotes some good thinking on these issues. If you have questions or thoughts on it, I'd love to hear from you. You can reach out to me through the contact form on our website. You can also visit the shepherds.edu website to visit Shepherds Theological Seminary and see what's going on there. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you and make his face shine upon you.